There was a civilization that lived centuries ago that many people today look at as a crazy religion with a misunderstood way of life. What they fail to realize is even though they were not as advanced as today's society, they were closer to modern religions than most people think. Their hieroglyphics, temples, and records show that the ancient Egyptians had a concept they strongly believed in, and this concept was of the human soul. The Egyptians had a belief of the soul as an entity, separate from the person, which went into the afterlife upon a person's death. The field of offerings, what the Egyptians called the afterlife, was a place of peace and tranquility where the soul would live for the rest of eternity. This place was ultimately the final destination for a person and was a place that everyone wanted to end up. But in order to get into the field of offerings, the person needed to know a lot about the soul. Knowledge on this person's soul was very important to Egyptian citizens because of the system of getting into the afterlife. So the Ba and the Ka was essential to know. Not only was it important to know the ins and outs of the Ba and Ka, but also the preparations that must be made for the afterlife. Overall, this was a big part in tradition and customs of ancient Egypt, and increasingly enough is very similar to modern religions. Before more is said about a person's Ba and Ka, how long has the tradition and belief of the Ba and Ka been around? Early estimates of this practice or belief dates back to around 3500 BC, when the first recorded mummies were found. This practice went on for hundreds of years, which means that it was a very strong belief and was essential to the culture of Egypt for it to last that long. Also, this practice shaped society in more ways than one. For instance, just like Christians, violence and sin was looked down on, and many people steered away from this to ensure everlasting peace in the afterlife. Also, it allowed the pharaohs to exploit work out of slaves. He could exploit work not just because they were slaves and they got whipped, but because going against the pharaoh was like going against God. Now that more knowledge is gained on this concept, what is a person's Ba, and why is it important? Ba is one of the two souls a person has. This spirit is seen as a human-headed bird that watches over the body when dead. This is also part of the soul that could travel between both the human world that people lived on and the afterlife that the Egyptians believed in. This soul, in order to survive in the afterlife, required food, which is the reason why Egyptians left food at a person's grave. It needed food because the Ba needed energy to fly to the field of offerings and energy to occasionally fly back to its deceased body. Now that we know what the Ba is, what is the Ka? The Ka is the other half of the person's soul and serves a different purpose after death. The Ka is a person's double that becomes separated after death. Just like the Ba, the Ka required food in order to survive the afterlife. To the Egyptians, the Ka was the most important part of the soul. The hieroglyph for Ka is seen as two upraised arms, symbolizing embrace or protection of his or her Ka. Interestingly enough, there is also the concept of the internal and external Ka. The internal Ka is said to be, quote, something that created the physical and mental activities, unquote. This internal Ka is also thought to be what a person's individual traits were. If a person was always upset, if they were depressed, if they were happy, then the Egyptians would say that they had an unhappy, depressed, or happy Ka. Along with this is a person's external Ka, or the other half. This part of the Ka is the spiritual half, or the one that lives on after death. How does a person prepare for the afterlife and ensure that their Ba and Ka will survive? It was believed early on that only the pharaoh could live in the afterlife to fight with Ra against evil. However, not everyone could gain entry. There were strict guidelines to follow, and if they were not met, then access to the field of offerings was denied. However, that eventually changed when Osiris allowed everyone into the afterlife. The 4 steps to guaranteeing eternal life consisted of having a light heart, living a good life, having a preserved body, and having your name written down. First off is having a light heart. When a person dies, the soul goes to the temple of Mat, the goddess of law and truth, where their heart, or conscience, is judged. Anubis takes the person's heart, which is weighed on a scale against a feather of Mat. If the person's heart weighs less than the feather, then the person has lived a good life without excessive sin and is qualified to enter the afterlife. If a person's heart weighs more than the feather, then that means the life the person has lived was full of sin. If this happens, Anubis takes the person's soul and, based on hieroglyphics in the temple of Mat, gives it to Ammit, where it is devoured, and in return the soul will have no chance for a peaceful afterlife. The devouring by Ammit is greatly feared by Egyptians, and was a great incentive to live decent lives. This demon, Ammit, was terrifying, with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, whose only purpose was eating the soul, resulting in the total annihilation of the person with no hope of further existence. Once a person has passed Mat's judgment, then they have to worry about the second step, which is having a body left for their Ba and Ka to return to. To preserve the body, mummification must be done. By having this done, the person's body will be there for the soul. If there is no body, then the Ba and Ka will be lost forever, and the afterlife won't be available for the individual. Mummification, though, was an elegant system, and was a very important part of death. Egyptian embalmers would have 3 levels of embalming for the price the family was willing to pay for it. The first level of embalming was for the rich class citizens, and they had the best embalming done. According to the article on Egyptian mummification on History.com, they would, quote, remove the brain through the nose before emptying the abdomen through a small slit. For the second type of embalming, for the middle class, they would fill the abdominal cavity with cedar oil, which was thought to liquefy the intestines, stomach, liver, and lungs. And finally, for the cheapest form of embalming, for the lower class citizens who were tight on finances, the embalmers would simply flush the body with water and leave it in salt for 70 days. For the families that were unfortunate and had no money, it wasn't uncommon for the bodies to be buried in the desert to dry out the bodies naturally so decay would not set in, thus preserving the body. Also, early on in Egyptian culture, twig mats were used for bodies to lie on, and as a coffin, a twig box was fashioned. Coffins started being used years after the beginning of this practice. Lastly, the individual must have their name written down. The person's name must be written down on a cartouche because, just like the preserved body, the soul will be lost and not know who it belongs to. A cartouche that would have been used in ancient Egypt might look like the one that's on the screen. Along with this is an interesting fact that overall, Egyptian society had a relatively low crime rate. There were of course murders that occurred, which based on rule of law in ancient Egypt required, in most cases, an eye for an eye type punishment. However, grave robbing was a serious issue and deemed by Egyptians to be the most heinous crime a person could commit due to the effects it would have on a person's Ba and Ka. Zero tolerance was allowed for this, and in hopes to stop tomb raiders, the Egyptians would put traps in tombs to kill the intruders. False wells were popular in tombs, and what they were was essentially a false cover, like a wood plank, over a deep hole, which a person could not escape when they fell in. Another one was head wires, which was a wire placed at head level that would decapitate anyone who walked into them. Lastly is the falling rock. Not quite like Indiana Jones, however. It did use a very large rock that would fall onto the intruder if they activated the trigger. Some people did get through all the traps and escape with valuables from the tomb. If they were caught, the punishment was usually death. How does Ba and Ka compare to other religions today, and why is it relevant? Although this belief from the ancient Egyptians has not been around since the Romans, many of their beliefs still carry on to many other religions. What things are still being practiced in religion today that the Egyptians did? Egyptian belief had the base of an afterlife, a soul, and judgment after death. The soul is a very big part of many religions today. Christians, Catholics, and more hold the soul to be a big part of a person that, when after death, rises into the afterlife. This concept has been around for centuries and is a big part of religious belief today. Both ancient Egyptians and today's religions both hold that concept. They also both hold the belief that the soul is separated after death. They believe that the soul is a separate entity in the person and is what makes you, you. The belief is that the body is a vessel in which your soul resides until it is lifted into the heavens. The Egyptians believed this as well with regards to a person's ka, or more specifically, the person's internal ka. This ka was a separate entity inside the body that consisted of the traits a person had, and is just like what other religions believe. Also, they shared the similarity that the soul was separated at death and transcended into the heavens. Just like a person's ka and ba in ancient Egypt, the soul was believed to leave the person's body after death, where it went into heaven. Lastly is the final judgment. Both Egyptians and religions today believe you go through before entering heaven. In order to pass God's judgment, or maths, a good life must be lived. All these correlate into each other. However, there are differences. For instance, the aspect of the soul is indeed slightly different from other religions. The Ba and Ka are two separate souls, which is different than the one soul many religions today teach.